Be me Greg, CFO at a mid-sized ESG consulting firm called Verdant Advisory. Been here 12 years, which is longer than most people stay anywhere these days. Watched the place grow from a 3-person operation in a rented shared office to 40-something employees across 2 floors of a building downtown. We help corporations look good on paper, emissions audits, diversity compliance reviews, supply chain ethics assessments, governance frameworks. Basically, we sell companies the feeling that they're doing the right thing and they pay well for that feeling. The product is legitimacy. The irony of what eventually happened at our own company is genuinely impressive when you step back and look at it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Scott founded the company when ESG was starting to become something investors actually required, rather than just suggested. Decent guy, not stupid, but the kind of person who avoids conflict the way some people avoid certain foods. Completely functional when things are running smoothly. Completely useless when a real decision has to be made under pressure. He hired me to handle the financial side because he openly admitted numbers made his eyes glaze over. Said he needed someone who liked spreadsheets more than people. I told him that was a fair characterization. We got along fine for a long time. For most of those 12 years, the company was a good place to work. Small enough that everyone knew everyone, professional enough that things actually got done. We had our share of difficult personalities and internal politics, but nothing that couldn't be managed. Then Brooke arrived, and the internal climate started changing in ways that were hard to name at first. She came in as COO about 3 years before everything I'm about to describe. Scott brought her in through a contact from a conference he'd attended. Her background was in organizational consulting, which meant she was experienced at restructuring teams and very fluent in the vocabulary of progressive workplace culture. She could use words like systemic and structural and equity in sentences without ever being asked to define them. She had this particular kind of confidence that doesn't leave room for other people. Not loud, not aggressive, just settled in her certainty. The kind of person who acts like every decision has already been made and everyone else just needs to catch up. At first, I didn't pay her much attention beyond the professional courtesies. She had energy, she was sharp in client meetings. She closed a couple of solid deals in her first months. Scott was visibly relieved to have someone competent running operations. I kept doing what I'd always done, tracking the numbers, running projections, attending the meetings I had to attend, and leaving the ones I didn't. Then I started noticing the hiring patterns in her department. Every new position that opened under her got filled by a woman. In the beginning, you could explain any individual hire without much trouble. Better candidates, stronger interview performance, more directly relevant background, reasonable enough on a case-by-case basis. But over 14 months, her department went from a mixed team with a slight female majority to a team that was almost entirely female. She kept 2 junior men, both of them recent hires in entry-level roles, and 1 man working a part-time contract arrangement, out of 14 total headcount. I noted the numbers, kept a running file, said nothing. That's my operating style. Document first. Speak if and when it matters. The thing about working in ESG consulting specifically is that everyone in the building is extremely careful about what they say out loud. The company exists to advise clients on ethical behavior and equitable practices. So internally, there's this permanent performance happening where every statement has to pass through an invisible filter before it gets spoken. You don't say, "I disagree with this approach." You say, "I want to make sure this is fully aligned with our equity framework." You don't say, "This hire doesn't make sense." You say, "I'd like to revisit the selection criteria to ensure they're bias neutral." It creates an environment where people stop saying what they actually think, and where the person most fluent in the correct vocabulary has an enormous structural advantage. Brooke was the most fluent person in the building by a significant margin. Her first visible power move came 8 months in. There was a performance review cycle, and one of the men in her department, someone who'd been doing solid work for about 2 years, disagreed with her in a team meeting about a client timeline. He wasn't rude about it, didn't raise his voice, just made his case and said he thought the schedule was unrealistic. She smiled, said she appreciated the input, said she'd take it under advisement. That was the end of the meeting. 2 weeks later, he was on a formal performance improvement plan. The documentation cited attitude and communication style. Nobody said anything about the connection between those 2 events out loud, but everyone in the department felt the temperature change. After that, the remaining men on her team became very quiet. One of them told me over lunch a couple of months later that he'd decided to just do exactly what he was asked and nothing beyond that. Don't volunteer opinions, don't push back, don't suggest alternatives. Just execute the task in front of him and keep his head down. I asked if that was working for him. He said it was better than the alternative. I asked what the alternative was. He kind of smiled and changed the subject. I understood what he meant. Around the same time, Brooke started running internal workshops, mandatory attendance framed as professional development and culture building. I sat through 3 of them over the course of about 5 months. The content varied slightly, but the structure was the same. A lot of material about unconscious bias, about patterns of male behavior in professional settings, about what she described as default male culture, shaping workplace norms in damaging ways. She had a slide in the second workshop that listed specific behaviors associated with this pattern: interrupting, taking credit for collective work, resisting feedback, centering personal experience in group discussions. Another slide about how toxic masculinity in the workplace wasn't always obvious and often appeared in subtle forms that women were trained to recognize and absorb. The overall framing was clear without ever being stated as a direct accusation. Men in the room represented a pattern that needed to be corrected. Women in the room represented the correction. Everyone in the room nodded because that was what you did. Scott attended one of the workshops and afterwards said it was exactly what the company needed, said it made their culture more authentic, and that clients would respond positively to a firm that held itself to its own standards. I wrote mandatory culture correction workshops, attendance logged in my file, and kept going. The document came about 6 months after the workshop started. Brooke brought it to Scott on a Thursday afternoon. I know it was Thursday because we had a standing finance review on Thursday afternoons, and she pulled him out of it early. He came back 40 minutes later, looking like he'd signed a catering approval, handed me a printed copy, and said Brooke had developed a new workforce framework that HR would be implementing. The document was called the Equitable Reduction Framework. It was 11 pages including appendices and references. The design was professional. The formatting was clean. It looked like something a compliance department would produce. The substance was direct. In the event of any headcount reduction at Verdant Advisory, the company committed to protecting female employees from disproportionate impact. Specifically, when positions needed to be eliminated, male-held positions should be prioritized for reduction. The stated rationale was that women face structural disadvantages in the broader job market and that a company committed to equity had an obligation to provide internal protection against layoff exposure. There was a full section explaining how failing to implement this priority constituted a form of institutional gender discrimination. There was a shorter section explaining that this framework aligned with the company's public ESG commitments and represented authentic application of its stated values. I read it twice at my desk. Then I read the implementation section a third time. Then I went to find the employment lawyer. He worked with us on a contract basis, a few hours a month, mostly reviewing agreements and the occasional HR matter. I found him in the small conference room he used when he was in. I slid the document across the table without saying anything. He read it without interrupting himself. When he finished, he set it down and said, "This is a significant problem." I asked him to be more specific. He said that any written policy that explicitly prioritizes layoffs based on gender, regardless of direction, creates substantial legal exposure, that if this policy were ever actually applied, and a male employee brought a discrimination claim, this document would be Exhibit A in that case. He said the framing as an equity measure didn't change the underlying legal reality. Explicit gender-based employment decisions are explicitly what discrimination law is designed to address. He said he was going to put together a memo. I told him Scott already had the document and had apparently approved it. He paused, said he'd write the memo anyway. The memo went to Scott and Kim, who ran HR under Brooke's oversight at that point. Kim was thorough, organized, genuinely good at the administrative side of HR. She was also fully aligned with Brooke in terms of how she understood workplace culture and what changes were necessary. They'd come up through similar backgrounds, used the same frameworks, trusted each other's judgment completely. The memo sat for 3 weeks without a formal response. Then Scott sent back a brief reply saying he'd discussed the concerns with Brooke and with their external ESG advisor, and they were confident the framework was legally sound and strategically consistent with the company's commitments. The lawyer wrote back one more time, a shorter note, more direct in its language. That response also went nowhere. I heard later that he'd mentioned it to Scott verbally, at least once more. Scott told him the decision had been made. After that, the lawyer stopped writing memos about it. I watched all of this and kept updating my file. Brooke announced the policy at an all-hands meeting that same month. Friday afternoon, full company, the usual setup in the main conference space with the screen at the front. She had a clean slide showing the document title and 3 bullet points summarizing the core commitment. Explained that Verdant was formalizing its dedication to equitable workforce practices. Said the company was putting its values into policy in a concrete and documented way. Said this was what it looked like when ESG principles were applied internally rather than just externally. Someone from the marketing team started clapping and several people followed. The mood was positive, at least among the majority of the room. I watched the men in the audience. The ones from other departments sat with the neutral professional expression that people wear when they're processing something they don't feel safe reacting to. The ones from Brooke's own department were particularly still. The man who'd been put on the performance plan and survived it was looking at the projection screen with an expression I couldn't fully read. The guy who'd told me over lunch that he'd just kept his head down was looking at his phone under the table. The one who'd been with the company for 6 years, the one who'd been on the floor at the previous all-hands looking at his feet, was now sitting very straight and looking directly at Brooke at the front of the room. Not with anger, not with anything obvious, just watching her. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and opened the staffing file. Brooke's department, current head count, 14 people, 11 female, 2 male junior staff, 1 male on part-time contract. I looked at that breakdown for a while. Then I opened the Equitable Reduction Framework document and looked at the implementation language again. Then I saved both files, named them clearly, and closed my laptop. The months that followed were uneventful on the surface. Brooke was increasingly visible outside the company. She was getting invited to speak at conferences and panels in the ESG and HR space. She'd developed something of a profile as a voice on equitable workplace practices. LinkedIn posts, speaking engagements, a profile piece in an industry newsletter. The public version of her was entirely consistent with the professional position she'd constructed internally. She was the person who had made her company walk the walk. I went to one of her conference appearances because Scott asked me to represent the company at the event. Sat in the back of a conference room and watched her deliver a 30-minute presentation on what she called structural protection frameworks. The Verdant policy was cited as a case study. She described it as an example of an ESG firm taking genuine accountability for its own practices. The audience was receptive. A few people came up to her afterwards asking for more information about how to implement something similar. She handed out business cards. I took the train back to the office and spent the rest of the day on a cash flow projection. The first actual layoff happened a few months after the policy announcement. Revenue had dipped enough that Scott agreed we needed to reduce positions. He asked each department head to identify which roles could be eliminated with the least operational impact. Brooke submitted recommendations alongside everyone else. 4 names, all male. 1 from her own department. 3 from other teams where she had input into the process. The man who'd been watching her at the all-hands was one of them. 6 years of continuous employment, consistent performance reviews, no formal incidents on record. His name was at the top of her list. I went to Scott privately and laid out what I was seeing, told him the pattern across the names was observable and that it would be observable to anyone reviewing the decisions from the outside. Scott said he trusted his department heads to make appropriate calls, said performance and role relevance were the criteria and those had been documented. I asked if he'd looked at the actual performance records. He said Kim had reviewed everything. I said Kim reports to Brooke. He said he appreciated my diligence and that the decisions were final. I went back to my desk. The 4 men were let go over the course of a week. The one with 6 years of tenure was the last meeting of the last day. I passed him in the hallway on his way out. He had a box with some personal items. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone who had already decided what came next. We exchanged a brief nod. I went to my office and closed the door. About 3 weeks later, HR received a formal complaint from him, filed through the state labor board, claimed gender-based discrimination in the layoff selection process, requested all internal documentation related to the reduction decisions, including any policy frameworks governing how selections were made. Kim brought me a copy of the filing. She looked calm, but there was something in how she set the paper on my desk that told me she understood what was about to get complicated. The next several weeks involved a lot of closed-door conversations that I wasn't directly part of. Brooke and Kim and Scott had extended meetings. The lawyer was brought back in, this time with more urgency than his memos had been treated with. I heard through the usual channels that the discussion kept circling around one central problem. The equitable reduction framework was now going to be part of any document production related to the complaint. The opposing attorney would have it. The document explicitly said men should be prioritized in layoffs, and a man had just been laid off in the first reduction after the policy was adopted. The policy said the company would treat male employees a certain way, and then the company had in fact treated male employees that way. The document was basically a written acknowledgement of the intent. The complaint was settled. I don't know the exact terms because I wasn't in those conversations. What I know is that a settlement was reached and the man signed off on it. What I also know, from a comment the lawyer made to me later, is that the settlement documents included disclosure of the internal policy framework. His attorney had it on file. That mattered for reasons that wouldn't become clear for several more months. After the settlement, Brooke was quieter internally for a while, not visibly rattled, but measured in a way that was slightly different from her usual register. She continued the external appearances, continued running her department, continued attending Scott's leadership meetings. But the internal workshop stopped being scheduled. I noticed but didn't comment on it. The company moved into a period of relative stability. A couple of new client contracts came in. The revenue picture improved. Scott seemed relieved. I kept running the projections, kept watching the market trends. The ESG consulting sector had been growing steadily for years, but there were signs that the growth was plateauing. Regulatory tailwinds that had driven corporate demand were getting complicated. Some large institutional investors were publicly questioning whether mandatory ESG spending delivered measurable returns. There was noise in the financial press about ESG being treated as overhead rather than strategy. I flagged it in my quarterly report to Scott. He read it and said he thought we were well positioned given our track record. I said I hoped so. I kept the flag in the next quarterly report too. The break came on a Monday morning. I was at my desk before 8 when the email came through. Our largest client, a manufacturing holding company that had been with us for 4 years, was terminating the contract. The termination letter was polite and professional. They cited shifting strategic priorities and a decision to consolidate vendor relationships. Nothing personal, nothing about performance. $2.3 million of annual revenue. Gone in a paragraph. Scott called me as I was still reading the email. His voice had that particular quality it got when he needed someone else to tell him what to do. I told him to come to my office. We sat for almost 2 hours going through the implications. I pulled up the projections I'd been building over the previous months, the ones I'd been flagging in reports he'd been optimistic about. They looked different now, with the largest contract removed from the revenue column. Scott asked about the second biggest client. I said I'd been watching their account closely and I had concerns. He said he'd reach out to their contact directly. That call happened the following week. They said they were pausing the engagement pending an internal budget review. I added them to the projected loss column in my model. With those two gone, the numbers were stark. I built out 3 scenarios over the following days: conservative, moderate, realistic. In all 3 of them, the company needed to reduce payroll by at least 30% within 60 days to maintain a stable operating position through the following 2 quarters. I printed the model in its full detail because I knew Scott needed to hold paper when a conversation was going to be difficult. I sat across from him at his desk while he went through it page by page. He was slow and careful this time, which told me he was taking it seriously. When he finished the last page, he looked up and asked me which department had the most room to cut without immediately damaging revenue capacity. I didn't answer right away. I pulled up the headcount file and turned the laptop so he could see the screen. Went through each department one by one. Client delivery was lean. Cutting there would directly reduce our ability to service whatever contracts remained. Finance was just me and 1 analyst. Marketing was small. The operations department was the outlier. 14 people, the largest single department. Most of their work structured around supporting the client delivery workflows that had been built around the contracts we'd just lost. With the big client gone and the second one paused, the operational load supporting those engagements had largely evaporated. The department was running at perhaps 40% utilization on a generous estimate. Scott looked at the screen for a long time. Then he said quietly, "That was Brooke's department." I said yes. He was silent for another moment. Then I opened a second window and positioned the Equitable Reduction Framework document next to the headcount breakdown, both visible at the same time. On the left, 14 people, 11 female, 2 junior male, 1 part-time male. On the right, the policy stating that male-held positions should be prioritized in any reduction. I didn't say anything. I just let him read. He read the policy section twice, the second time more slowly. Then he asked if there was another way to get to the number. I told him I'd looked at every combination. There weren't enough positions in other departments to hit 30%, without gutting the functions generating the remaining revenue. Operations was where the overhead was concentrated. He asked if we could spread smaller cuts across multiple departments instead of concentrating them. I showed him the model. Even spreading it as thinly as mathematically possible, operations still needed to carry the majority of the reduction. The numbers didn't have another answer. Scott asked me to schedule a meeting with Brooke for the following morning. "Just the three of us," he said. I sent the calendar invite that evening with no subject line except the words Q4 planning. The meeting was at 9. Brooke came in with her notebook and sat down looking composed and prepared. Scott walked through it methodically. The revenue losses, the timeline, the specific target. She listened, took notes, asked a few clarifying questions about the financial projections. She was professional throughout the setup. Then Scott said the reductions would need to come primarily from the operations department. There was a pause that was maybe 2 seconds long, but felt longer. She set her pen down, started talking about alternative approaches, temporary voluntary salary reductions across the leadership team, renegotiated vendor terms, accelerated new business development, pausing non-essential spend. I had figures ready for every one of those. Even combining all of them, the gap wasn't closed. She pushed back on the model. I walked her through the assumptions. She suggested a different revenue timeline for new business. I showed her our historical close rates and typical sales cycles. The math didn't change. Then Scott said they would be conducting the reduction in accordance with company policy. He slid a printed copy of the Equitable Reduction Framework across the table. The page was open to the implementation section. It was her document. Her language, her formatting, her arguments, her signature line at the bottom with the date. She looked at it, looked at the page number, looked at the section heading, looked at the specific paragraph Scott had underlined in pencil. Then she looked up, said she thought the policy had been designed to address systemic patterns across the company as a whole, that applying it mechanically to a single department wasn't consistent with the intent behind it. Scott said he didn't see a clause in the document limiting its scope. She said there was an implied contextual understanding that needed to be considered. Scott asked where that contextual understanding was documented. She didn't have an answer. He said the policy was active, formally adopted, filed with HR, and the company would conduct the reduction in compliance with it. She left quickly after that, gathered her things while Scott and I were still sitting there, and walked out without the usual close to the meeting. I stayed for a few minutes going over next steps with Scott. He looked tired. I expected her to come to my office within the hour. It was about 40 minutes. She sat across my desk and started with the framing that the policy's spirit versus letter distinction needed to inform how it was implemented, that a framework written to protect women from disproportionate layoff impact couldn't reasonably be applied in a way that made women bear a disproportionate layoff impact. I said I understood the argument she was making. Then I opened the headcount file and went through the numbers out loud, slowly. 14 people in operations, 3 male-held positions. To reach the 8-person reduction target, the policy required starting with those 3. After eliminating all 3, 5 more positions were needed to hit the target. The 5 remaining positions to eliminate would by definition be held by women. There was no other way to reach 8 from 14 when only 3 were male. That was consistent with the policy as written. Prioritize male positions, then address remaining business needs. She said, "That is not what I meant when I wrote it." I said, "I know." I closed the file. She stayed seated for a moment, then she left. Kim was next. I heard about it through the usual office channels over the following day. The conversation apparently lasted close to half an hour. Kim was in a genuinely difficult position, and she knew it. She had been the one to formally process the equitable reduction framework through the HR system. She'd filed it, recorded it, made it official company documentation. When Brooke came to her asking for interpretive flexibility, Kim had to explain the problem clearly. Any documented deviation from a formal company policy, in a way that could be characterized as favoring one gender, created legal exposure, particularly significant exposure given that there was already a settled complaint on file from the previous round of layoffs. The attorney from that case had the policy document. If Verdant now departed from its own written policy in a direction that happened to benefit female employees, and that came out in any subsequent review, it would look like selective enforcement, which would make the original reduction look even more intentionally discriminatory. Kim apparently explained this while looking at her desk. Brooke left that meeting without the outcome she'd been looking for. The third attempt was with Scott directly. He called me into the meeting, which told me he wanted documentation of whatever was said. Brooke's proposal this time was to formally rescind or amend the policy before proceeding with the reduction, frame it as a routine policy review rather than a response to circumstances. Scott said he'd already raised that possibility with the lawyer. The lawyer's assessment was unambiguous: rescinding or amending the policy immediately before conducting a major headcount reduction in a department that was more than 75% female would, in any subsequent legal analysis, look like the company removing a female protection specifically to facilitate a female-heavy layoff. It would almost certainly be characterized as retroactive discrimination. The existence of the open case from the first reduction, where opposing counsel already had the document, made the situation significantly more fraught. Any modification to the policy now would be discoverable in that case. The lawyer had been very direct. Scott told her there was no clean path to modifying the policy in the current window. She asked if there was any route that didn't put her in this position. Scott said he was sorry. She stood up and asked if that was the final answer. He said yes. She left. The list was hers to write. Scott was clear about that. It was her department, her direct reports, her organizational knowledge. She knew each person's role, their performance, their circumstances. Making those decisions belonged to the department head. That logic was consistent and defensible. It also meant she had to sit down and write 8 names. Kim received the completed list on a Friday afternoon in the early part of the month. I saw Kim's face when she came to give me the final headcount numbers for payroll adjustment purposes. She had the controlled expression of someone who had been practicing being neutral all day. The list had 3 male names at the top, followed by 5 female names. 2 of the women had been continuous employees for more than 2 years. One of them was someone Brooke had personally recruited away from a competing firm about 7 months earlier. Brooke had brought her over with direct assurances about the company's stability and the growth potential of the role. That name was on the list. Kim set the payroll summary on my desk and started to leave. I asked how she was doing. She stopped but didn't turn around, said she was making sure everything was documented correctly. Then she went back to her office. The individual meetings happened across 2 days the following week. I was not present for any of them. My office is adjacent to one of the small meeting rooms, and I couldn't avoid hearing some of what came through the wall. Not specific words, just the texture of the conversations. The pattern was recognizable even without content. A calm open, then an extended pause that meant someone was processing unexpected information, then the sound of movement toward the door. I happened to be stepping into the hallway when one of the doors opened. One of the women coming out had her jacket over her arm and her bag on her shoulder. She'd been with the company since near the beginning, long enough to have seen multiple versions of what the culture had been. She passed me in the hallway, and our eyes met briefly. She didn't stop walking. I didn't say anything. She went to her desk, took about 15 minutes to gather her things, and left the building. I watched from my doorway. The 3 men apparently took their meetings without much friction. One of them had been quietly interviewing elsewhere for about 2 months and seemed to have been waiting for the conversation. The 2 junior staff gave their acknowledgement, handed in their access credentials, and left the same afternoon. Someone mentioned to me later that one of them actually looked lighter walking out than he had looked arriving in the morning. I believed it without needing to know more details. The harder conversations were with the women. I didn't witness them directly, but Kim told me about it later in a moment of uncharacteristic candor. She said at least two of the conversations had been genuinely difficult. Not emotional in an obvious way, just precise in a way that was harder to manage. At least one of the women had asked directly and specifically why she was being let go, given that the company's documented policy stated men should be prioritized in workforce reductions. Brooke had answered with language about business structure and role redundancy and evolving operational priorities. The woman had said she had read the equitable reduction framework and wanted to understand how the answer given was consistent with Section 4 of that document. Brooke had not provided a clean answer. The woman had asked for all documentation related to her termination to be provided in writing. She left the meeting without raising her voice. Kim said she said please and thank you on the way out. Kim told me the in writing part specifically. I asked how she was planning to handle the documentation requests. She said she was going to make sure every record was thorough, complete, and accurate. Her voice was very even when she said it. Then she went back to her office and I went back to mine. The reduction was complete by the end of the week. Operations went from 14 people to 6. The 5 women and the 3 men who had been let go cleared out of the building by the following Monday. The department that Brooke had spent 2 years carefully building was gone. Most of the client workflows those roles had supported were also gone, which was the business rationale. The company's cost structure was now significantly leaner. The projections showed a runway extension of at least 3 quarters under a conservative revenue scenario. I expected some kind of external development after that, and I was right. The woman who had asked for everything in writing had retained an attorney. There were formal document requests made to the company within 3 weeks, production requests for employment records, communications, and policy documentation. The equitable reduction framework appeared on the request list by name. Same document, second case, second attorney. The lawyer came in on short notice to help manage the response. He was measured and professional about it. I noticed he didn't seem surprised. Scott pulled me aside after one of the legal update meetings and asked for my honest assessment. I told him the company's best near-term outcome was to stabilize operations, maintain clean documentation practices, avoid any further policy decisions that could be characterized as inconsistent, and eventually let the framework expire naturally during a future policy review cycle when the timing was legally clean. He asked about the company's medium-term position. I told him I thought the underlying business model needed to be reevaluated regardless of any of this. The market was shifting, and the consulting model we'd been running was going to require significant adaptation. He said he'd been thinking the same thing. Then he asked if I was planning to stay. I told him I'd been at Verdant for 12 years and thought it was probably time to find something else. He nodded. He said he understood. I think he was relieved in some way that I wasn't angry about it. It wasn't about anger, it was just time. My last day was about 6 weeks after the reduction was completed. I spent the final 2 weeks doing a thorough handoff, documenting every active model and projection in formats that would be usable by whoever came next. I found a position at a corporate finance firm that does straightforward transactional work with no particular ideological dimension to it. Regular companies, regular numbers, regular problems. The people there talk about revenue and costs without using the word equity, except in its accounting definition. It suits me better than I expected. Brooke was still technically COO when I left. Her title hadn't changed. She still attended the leadership meetings, still had an office, still represented the company at external events. But the operational scope of her role had shrunk considerably given that her department was less than half its previous size, and the client workload had contracted. From what I heard through occasional updates from someone still at the company, she was being gradually repositioned toward external-facing functions. Conferences, client presentations, thought leadership content. Away from internal operations. I don't know whose decision that was, or how clearly it was articulated to her. The equitable reduction framework, as far as I'm aware, was never formally rescinded. It's still filed in the HR documentation system as an active company policy. Nobody wants to touch it while the legal matters are ongoing. It just sits there, precisely where Kim filed it, unchanged. Written clearly, structured professionally, signed and dated. Authored by the one person who turned out to be most directly affected by it. I think about the man with 6 years of tenure sometimes. Solid track record, never caused trouble, filed a complaint because he believed something unfair had happened to him. He was correct. His attorney ended up with a document that agreed with him in writing, produced by the company itself. I don't know the full outcome of his situation. What I know is that he had the paperwork, and the paperwork said what it said. I also think about Kim occasionally. She was the one who processed every layer of this from start to finish. The original policy going in, the first reduction, the first complaint, the settlement, the second reduction, the second set of documentation requests. She had to maintain accurate records throughout all of it, accurate records of a sequence of events that she had been part of creating. I don't know how she made sense of that internally. She was still at her desk doing exactly that when I left, still making sure everything was thorough and accurate. Scott is still listed as CEO on the company's public profile. Brooke's name is still on the leadership page with the COO title. The company is smaller than it was, different roster of clients, adapted model, still operating. The policy document is still there too. In the system, under HR frameworks, active status. It says what it always said. She wrote the rules, she signed the rules applied to her. That's the whole story. I'm an accountant. I just kept the files.